Welcome, everyone. My name is Lindsay Glennie. I'm the Communications Associate with the United Church of Canada Foundation. I'm going to start us off today with our land acknowledgement, recognizing we are all gathering from different lands today. I'm joining from the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples, protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement. I move forward with gratitude for the stewardship and recognition of ongoing presence of First Nation, Métis, and Inuit communities. This webinar is being recorded, and it's going to be sent directly to the emails that you registered with once it's available. Our chat today as often will remain off. This is to ensure folks who are using any assistive technologies can fully access the webinar without interruption. So please don't use the chat or reactions during the webinar, and please keep yourself on mute for the duration of today's webinar. So without further ado, I want to welcome everyone to the last webinar of our 2026 Spring and Summer Series, Coffee with the Reverend Dr. Michelle Voss. Michelle is going to share with us her current book project, for which she received the 2024 McGeachy Senior Scholarship from the Foundation. She'll be sharing about Becoming Intercultural, a developmental framework for people of faith, which is forthcoming with Fortress Press. So thank you, everyone, for taking the time to join us today, and over to you, Michelle.
Thank you, Lindsay. Welcome, everyone. It's good to see you here. I will share that I am presently joining you from Toronto, the traditional territory of the Huron-Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, and the Mississaugas of the Credit, which is subject to the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant. I am really grateful for the opportunity to share this work. And I'm especially grateful to the United Church of Canada Foundation, which supported the research with the McGeachy Senior Scholarship in 2024, and also to the many, many people in the United Church and in the Canadian interfaith community who have shared their experiences with me as a part of this project. It's been a real pleasure to pivot from my expertise in comparative theology and my leadership in theological education to think in a pretty practical way about how to become intercultural. And so, as Lindsay shared, I'll be sharing from my book project, Becoming Intercultural, a developmental framework for a developmental approach for people of faith. And I'm about ready to send the book off to the publisher, Fortress Press, and it will come out sometime in 2027, perhaps in time for Emmanuel College's 100-year anniversary celebrations, perhaps in time for the American Academy of Religion release, but it'll come out in 2027. So the essence of the project is that I've been trying to think in practical ways and theological ways about helping churches and interfaith communities to become more genuinely intercultural. And this has a lot to do with who I am as a person. I moved around a lot as a kid. I was a preacher's kid, and I experienced life in several distinct regions of the United States before moving to Toronto in 2018. And and of course, the regional differences were always very interesting to me. The accents, I could never quite shed my Midwestern accent. Um, and just noticing how people did things differently, thought about things differently. And as I went through my theological education, I also experienced cultural shifts related to my religious and theological identity. So I was raised in the Christian Reformed Church, which is pretty intentionally a pretty inward focused kind of religious community. We had our Christian schools, and most of us were of Dutch heritage, and that seemed to be pretty intentional. And as I went through my theological education and started studying mainline Christian theologies, started really developing an interest in Hindu traditions and thinking comparatively about that. I realized that my education had been a bit of an off-ramp from the religious culture that I was raised in, and that was hard, right? It's hard to kind of suddenly realize you're on the outside and people telling you things like you're not a real Christian or that they're worried about your salvation and things like that. But in my journey, this cultural toolkit that I'm going to share with you has been part of what's helped me to view it in a different lens that's maybe more productive and more it just kind of interesting, right? Just to say like, oh, the folks who raised me, with whom I'm still in relationship, we're part of different cultures, and I can move in and out with the awareness of doing so, and do that with love and hopefully with some wisdom. I will not claim that that's the easiest one to do, but when I was at Wake Forest University School of Divinity, as a professor of theology and academic dean, this is a place that's in North Carolina in the US South. And half of our students at our ecumenical divinity school were Black and half were white, and within the context of a predominantly white university. When I was there, we started using a tool called the Intercultural Development Inventory. And maybe some of you have experienced this in your leadership trainings or in your theological education, perhaps. The Association of Theological Schools and also several denominations have been employing it with leaders to assist with their initiatives related to things like globalization or DEI. Other diversity initiatives. And so over the years, so I encountered that as a really useful and informative tool at Wake Forest. And over the years, I eventually became trained as a qualified administrator of the IDI. And so it's a framework that's just been working on my imagination over the years. Um, I'll also share that my research in Hindu-Christian relations brought me to India several times and added extra layers of awareness around my formation as someone who, being raised in the US, I value independence and kind of taking risks and moving forward. And in India, also my feminism, right? Some of those things got challenged when I was living with a host family in India, right? Around being a younger woman who was like not visibly attached to a man while I was there. And in those kinds of tensions I've thought about in cultural terms. And that's been really just fascinating, right? And also helpful for sorting things through. So I was very much uh, inspired by the United Church of Canada's declaration in 2006, um, with the intention to become an intercultural church. I've been thinking, like, well, what does that mean? And the vision is really beautiful of mutual sharing across cultural groups. And I've been also wondering, well, how do you get there? How do you know when you've gotten there? And what are the kinds of benchmarks, right? Is there only one kind of intervention or solution that's intercultural? And the IDI, the Intercultural Development Inventory, is something that's helped me to think through how our communities can benchmark where we are in our intercultural journeys and what would be the appropriate interventions given an accurate view of what our communities are developmentally capable of doing. It's really all about meeting people where they are. It's generally unhelpful to have a sense of like, well, our vision says we should be fully mutual and exchanging across boundaries and totally have solved all of the power inequities and so forth. That would be great, and that's a vision to work for. And there are steps along the way. And so this has helped me to think about that. I'm also inspired in learning more and more about, as a dual Canadian and US citizen, about the different cultures across the United Church of Canada and across Canada, the Indigenous cultures and the different regional cultures. There are so many ways that we're intercultural within this denomination, within this nation. The United Church very wisely has shifted from the kind of Canadian multiculturalism where everybody kind of stays in their own backyards and maybe shares their foods and festivals and things like that to something that's a deeper kind of intercultural relationship. And the other piece of this is also the multi-religious piece at Emmanuel College. I came as principal in 2018 at a time when the multi-religious programs had been created, but the word that the college was using when they invited me was to consolidate those programs. So how do we move from the multi-religious to the interreligious? How do we learn to relate very genuinely to one another? So the project, out of all of those different contexts, takes up a central question of how do communities move from the fact of diversity to forms of common life that are equitable, honor difference, and orient towards transformation rather than assimilation. The IDI intercultural development tool is often used with leaders and tends to and can play into a kind of neoliberal focus on the individual and their attitudes. There's a lot more capacity and potential there. What the tool is often used for is to work with groups of people to figure out where, as a community, do we orient? How do we tend to relate to one another across cultures? And once we have a good profile of that, you can start taking steps in your community to develop from where you are. And so the book is really focusing on groups. It's not so much about like getting the individual leader kind of to a certain point or anything like that. It's really a kind of diagnostic, if you will, with a sense of developmentally where can a community go next. So I want to introduce the intercultural development continuum to you and then share, time permitting, one or two ways that the developmental model of intercultural sensitivity can help churches to navigate difficult situations. Thinking specifically about the United Church of Canada, I want to zero in on conversations relating to gender and sexuality and those relating to race. And I'm going to do that through two different kind of stops along the developmental continuum to give you a sense of how this can be useful. So this is a visualization of the intercultural development continuum that was developed by an Emmanuel College student named Varut. Varut was taking the first year multi-religious cohort course at Emmanuel College, and we were having a group debrief on the intercultural development inventory. We were learning about ourselves as a community, and part of the presentation had this really controversial kind of image that everybody hated to show the five different orientations that this continuum names. It was like an arrow and it was an ascending arrow. And so it was like there's a direction and this one is better than the other ones. And we spent a lot of time kind of talking about that. And Varut is a graphic designer. And so he showed up with this kind of inspired visualization of the different orientations. So the intercultural development continuum was developed by someone named Mitch Hammer out of an earlier model by Milton Bennett called the Developmental Model of Intercultural Sensitivity. It spans five different orientations called towards cultural difference: denial, polarization, minimization, acceptance, and adaptation. They're not fixed categories of people or labels for people. They're capacities that individuals and communities may exhibit in particular situations. Each one has different growing edges. And so discerning your community's orientation is the key to finding developmentally appropriate interventions. The graphics show some things about the orientations. So at denial, you see a gray background and then yellow stars that are kind of isolated from each other. So at denial, people are relatively unaware of or uninterested in exploring cultural differences. In my research, I've found that sometimes there are attitudes that sound like denial of just like not even recognizing that difference is among us, where people can be like blindsided when issues of, race or gender come up and they're really kind of they just don't know what to do with that yet. Um, I will say though that the population as a whole has only about like 2 or 3% of individuals who would orient in denial, which means that in an organization, there's a very low chance that an entire organization is functioning at the level of denial. There's more awareness of difference, especially given how connected we are globally through the media and so forth. The next one is polarization. And in polarization, you can see there are strong contrasts in the colors, and there's only two colors. In polarization, there's a very strong sense of us and them, and those us and them are very clear categories, but also pretty kind of stereotyped or generalized ideas of who we are and who they are. Right? And then in minimization, the colors are very muted. And this is a orientation in which people tend to seek out what they hold in common with each other, and they're less comfortable discussing differences. They might be afraid of offending other people, and so or they might just want to go along to get along, right? Acceptance has the same kind of pattern, but more colors. And so at acceptance, people develop a complex understanding of cultural similarities and differences. And that's both within their own cultures and then also with other cultures. So there's more understanding at acceptance, but then people are sometimes unsure what to do with all of that information. And then moving on to adaptation, you can see it's all those same colors, but with those bridges, those kinds of connectors between the colors. At adaptation, people become skilled at choosing interculturally sensitive courses of action, and they can also help other people become bridge builders between diverse groups. So, the crucial insight of this developmental scheme is that each orientation calls for a different kind of engagement. When leaders misread the developmental location of a community, then their interventions can intensify conflict or cause harm. Conversely, when they respond appropriately and in a developmental way, even very deeply divisive issues can become sites of growth. So I want to talk a bit about how in my research I've found polarization to show up in the United Church around gender and sexuality, and minimization to show up around issues of race. Here's our polarization image. So, in many North American churches, including the United Church of Canada, questions of gender identity and sexuality aren't merely issues of disagreement. They're structurally polarized. So, polarization is called a monocultural orientation. It looks at things from one cultural point of view and evaluates others against that. And so that can happen among people who are resisting progressive change. It can also happen among people who are defending it. So, for example, one of the things that we see at Emmanuel College, which is an ecumenical theological setting, students who are formed in a denomination like the United Church that has strong commitments to gender expansive language and LGBTQ inclusion may expect that those commitments will be just non-negotiable norms across all of the context in the Toronto School of Theology. And sometimes you'll see people who just refuse to engage with people who are formed in other religious traditions that have other views about these things. They may silence people who's in the name of inclusion, right? So paradoxically, the value of openness becomes a boundary marker that excludes other people. And then conversely, communities with more traditional views of sexuality and gender may exhibit defensive polarization. They perceive inclusive practices as threats to biblical authority or communal identity. So both of those dynamics reinforce an impasse. I'm just describing here. This is descriptive. Um, one place that this showed up in relation to gender happened at a church gathering where there was an African Canadian worship team leading the singing, and it was a vibrant service. It included testimony, music, expressions of faith shaped by their own cultural and theological contexts. And then later on, there was a kind of question and answer period, and a white attendee rebuked the service and the organizers for having insufficient gender inclusive language. So the concern of the white attendee reflects an important theological commitment. And at the same time, the intervention functioned to discipline a racialized community's expression of faith according to dominant United Church norms. So, what was expressed by one participant as fidelity to justice was experienced perhaps by others as erasure. So, that's just a classic symptom of polarization. Each side experiences itself as protecting what's most sacred, while the other appears as a threat. Now, let's think developmentally about this. In polarized environments, the instinct is often to intensify the argument, just present more data, have stronger theological claims, have clearer moral reasoning. But developmentally, that's not effective, right? Arguing makes people argue harder, right? Polarization is generally not resolved through better arguments. It's softened through relationship. So, thinking relationally and thinking developmentally about polarization, the first task in a community that is orienting in a polarizing way is humanization, relationship, getting to know one another. And so, practices like storytelling, shared experiences, sustained relational engagement can begin to destabilize rigid categories. Um, and so, I have found in my own life with people from my own religious upbringing that the way that people change their mind on things like sexuality is through relationship. It's not through arguing with each other. It's through knowing each other and realizing some things, like I want to get to know my grandchild, and my grandchild identifies as queer. It's expansion through realizing the shared humanity and the goodness that we all bring. Um, I also really want to make the intervention here that this relation building has to be done in ways that are trauma informed. So leaders need to be aware of this. People whose very existence is under debate, particularly LGBTQ people, can't be expected to bear the burden of educating others or entering unsafe spaces, right? And so that's just really important. And so, in a context like a classroom where people are like, I'm feeling unsafe now, I'm never going to ask them to be like, no, this is your job in a polarized environment to like make humanizing connections with people. The burden is really on the part of those in the dominant culture. Uh, to form the relationships and for leaders to figure out safe and trauma-informed ways for people to connect, right? And I have a lot more I could say about that, but we're almost out of time. I haven't talked yet about race, and so I just want to say in a couple of moments that. Uh, in the United Church, we tend to have a minimizing approach to race. I've been to some racial justice trainings where you will hear people say, well, we're all God's children. I was taught to love everyone. And they're theologically sound. They also function to deflect attention away from difference. And so the growing edge when we're at a place of minimization is not to emphasize what's common, like in polarization, but rather to lean into difference. And that means learning more about your own culture, as well as learning more about other cultures. So, for dominant culture folks in Canada and the United Church, learning about one's own culture means learning about whiteness, right? And so what that means is not white people or people with who have light skin per se, but the way that whiteness functions as a cultural norm. And here are just some of the cultural norms that scholars and activists have noticed that whiteness as a culture tends to like to universalize, assume that one's own norms, liturgies, communication patterns, forms of authority are simply normal. Right? And that's something to work through as one learns about whiteness. Also, silence and fragility, discomfort with discussing differences or being divisive, that's an aspect of white culture. Also, the tendency to spiritualize, like let's just emphasize love and unity and grace, that can be a way to bypass structural analysis. So once we realize this about whiteness, it's an invitation to lean into difference and start getting more comfortable with difference. And also self-sufficiency is a big aspect of whiteness as a culture. And that can obscure some of the relational and communal forms of life that are valued in other cultures. And so, in the book, I ask us to think about the United Church anti-racism policy that begins with the theme, that all may be one. And the document's beautiful theologically. It emphasizes humanity, equality before God, celebration of diversity. And so then if we think developmentally with that, the growing edge on our anti-racism commitments is to lean into difference and become more comfortable, and that's going to lead in the acceptance orientation to oftentimes not knowing exactly what to do, but having a lot more information about our differences and about the power differences. Um, so that's all I have time to share with you today. I probably got too far into the gender example today, but it gives you a sense of, I hope, the usefulness of this a tool as a tool, this intercultural framework to think, where are we right now? And what might be a wise path forward in the community that I'm leading so that we can work towards becoming an intercultural church. The book will have a lot also on interfaith contexts and how these different orientations relate to that. And I will look forward to hopefully more opportunities to share with you, to present in your communities, maybe another webinar once the book comes out. So thank you once again for having me here, and I will turn it back to Lindsay.
Thank you so much, Michelle. That was absolutely wonderful, very insightful. I thank you, really. That was very thought-provoking. I love the visuals that you incorporated as well, and I just appreciate your time being here today. I want to thank everyone else for attending today. Thank you so much for coming out. And I just want to remind everyone this was the last webinar of our 2026 spring and summer series, but we will be back with our fall winter series in September. And the recording from today's webinar will be distributed in the follow-up email to the email that you registered with when it's available and uploaded to YouTube. So thank you again, everyone, for attending today, and we will see you back here in the fall.